It's great to be here today. I think my role this afternoon, I can't even pretend to be in California, is to walk through the overarching requirements and resources available in the American Rescue Plan. I'm going to call it ESSER III. It kind of rolls off the tongue a little bit better. But the deck that I'm going to walk you through at a somewhat brisk pace is also reflective of resources that we have on our website. And of course, I'll be available afterwards for questions. Hopefully a lot of this is familiar or starting to feel familiar in the few months since passage of these laws, but let's kick it off. Pat, if you want to go ahead and move it forward. So just by way of reminder, we're in unprecedented times these days with the amount of dollars that are flowing from Washington into K-12 education. We have a total of $189 billion through the 3 acts that have passed during the pandemic. And by way of comparison, we're seeing about $42 billion that come out on an annual basis. For K-12, that's everything. So as we are all have a sense right now, we're in historic times in terms of the amount of resources that are flowing within a short period of time. So for ARPA or ESSER III, we have $129.9 billion, as well as $800 million that are specifically tagged for identifying and serving homeless students, and then kind of a plus up of funds for serving students with disabilities in IDEA, an additional $2.5 billion. So that's just to make you aware that there are some different pots of funding, but we're mainly going to be focused on this first pot of funding today. So for the $122 billion, these funds flow as the other acts have allocated funding the same way to the states and the same way to the districts. However, the pie is divided up a little differently. Under ESSER III, 10% can be held by the state. And there are different requirements for how that pot can be used, and at least 5% is going to be for activities and interventions that will be available. It's not just state admin that will be available to districts and other things that schools can benefit from, or other statewide initiatives. We can move on to the next slide. So the 90% that's allocated to school districts, and that includes charter LEAs that are their own districts for purposes of state law. Their allocation, 20% of it has to be used for learning recovery purposes and for activities connected to that. All of the SEA and LEA evidence-based learning loss activities also have to address student emotional needs, and they must address the disproportionate impact of COVID on subgroups of students. So this is an attempt to capture the range of allowable uses of funds, but it's not an exhaustive list. I think every time you put the use of funds into a list, it actually kind of reduces creative thinking, because the last thing I think that folks want to see is after 3.5, 4 years of funding that you look back and your money was just spent on a bunch of little one-off activities or stuff. And it's hard to see where it moved things forward in terms of the education of your students. But just to give a sense of the breadth of what it's available to spend for, we have this list. And so that includes pretty much any activity that's currently authorized under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, IDEA, Adult Ed, Career and Technical Education, activities to address the needs of certain student subgroups, technology, sanitation and cleaning, mental health services, staffing, supports, facility repairs, COVID testing, learning recovery, and tutoring. And we'll get a little bit more into this in a bit. And then as part of getting the money, there is a planning process that districts and the state must go through. Each LEA receiving funds has to develop and make publicly available on its website, not 30 days after receiving the allocation, a plan for the safe return to in-person instruction and continuity of services. And there's a public comment process that's part of this. The Department of Education has released guidance and rules that actually spell out in much more detail what districts must do as part of this. Now, if you're a single school LEA, some of those requirements are not going to apply. But if you're a school that's in a district that's going through this comment process, this is more relevant to you. Also, your state is required to have an engagement process and submit a plan by June 7th. And hopefully you're already aware of that process, but that is, even though some of the funding is already flowed, a lot of this is required to get the last tranche of funding. So in addition to the K-12 funding, there's also an emergency connectivity fund, which is $7.2 billion for schools and libraries, and can be used for devices. And the federal government will cover 100% of those costs, subject to any FCC determined caps. This program is not fully implemented yet. I think we're still waiting guidance and rules related to the implementation of this program. However, it has just recently launched what was in the second relief package. Well, that's not really helpful because it depends on how you count them, but the one before ESSER III, the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, which actually provides benefits directly to families, to low-income families. So that's an important program that's just getting underway that you should hopefully be aware of. So common questions about uses of funds. We are still waiting specific guidance on ESSER III, and this particular guidance will have the unique stamp of the Biden administration on it, because the previous guidance that's been issued really was under the Trump administration. And we have no idea what, if any, significant changes there could be. I mean, there's only so much that can be done because the statute is pretty clear on the wide breadth of funding uses that are available. But there is some guidance that indicates that funds should not generally be used for bonuses, merit pay. We would add executive pay, unless it's somehow very closely tied to disruptions or closures. And you can use funds for recruitment and retention, substitute teachers, incentives to teach certain student populations, summer learning, longer school days, improving teacher quality, teacher training in order to accelerate learning. Those are all appropriate uses of funds, as well as additional transportation costs to provide social distancing while getting kids to school. And I just put here other initiatives or policies with high upfront costs. Maybe there's been something that your school has been considering, but had a high initial investment. Obviously, there's a fiscal cliff. You don't want to sign on to staffing and personnel that you can't continue to pay once this funding dries up, but it is opportunities for to make a significant down payment on something that you want to implement for the long term, like a curriculum. High quality instructional materials is another bucket. Real property or modular classrooms to respond to COVID-19. Social distancing may necessitate that. It could also be needed to provide longer school days or summer school or pre-K programs. But there are specific rules that are triggered, that federal rules, if you start going down the road of investing in renovation, construction, any of that. And you also have to get permission. So, and also pay Davis-Bacon prevailing wage rules. So it gets a little bit more complicated, but it's certainly a use of funds that is permissible. Also for budgetary shortfalls and gaps in funding, it can be used for that. So considerations for planning, these are just some questions to ask. I mean, some of them are pretty self-explanatory, but what we have heard is a theme in folks that are putting together resources in order to help guide and encourage good spending and stewardship of resources. Where do you want to be by the end of 2024 with your students? Really to setting some big measurable goals that you can attach your other spending to. And then also just whether the uses of funds at a more micro level will actually prevent, prepare, and respond to COVID-19. What's the data? What additional approvals are allowed? And then unfortunately, what are the optics? You have to explain, in 3 or 4 paragraphs how it's justified or why it isn't an illicit use of funds, it's probably not something that you want to do, especially since charters are subject to additional scrutiny. There's also potential that you are subject to a higher level of audit that you may not be used to. If you have received less than $750,000 in prior year of federal funding, you may not have been subject to uniform guidelines for federal grants. Your state may already have had such standards in place regardless of your receipt of federal funds, but in other places, it may be a significant shift in the audit standards that you have to meet. So that's something you should certainly get an answer to if you don't know that already. Other things to avoid, obviously, conflicts of interests, lack of transparency. Again, in the process of putting together your local plans as required by the feds, your engagement process, how does it compare to non-charter schools around you? Are you going above and beyond in getting input, but also how you're spending the money? Definitely avoid non-compliance and make sure that you know that you have the approvals that you need for some of these trickier expenses like renovations and capital expenditures, paying down debt, that sort of thing. Again, charters will be under scrutiny. Any audit findings under federal audits will go into a national database. They're easily searchable. Obviously, that's not the only reason to avoid this, but just to keep in mind that there will be a lot of people looking at how this funding is spent over the next few years. So more specifically about charter schools, there's our estimate just based on population and factoring in poverty at about $7 billion of just the ESSER III should be flowing to charter schools. Now, some of this depends on whether you're a charter LEA and you're getting a direct formula-based allocation from your state, or whether you're having to advocate more on your behalf to your district that is not subject to really any rules in terms of what they give charters. It's important to know your path and how to get transparent information from your district if you're not an LEA. There are also certainly significant opportunities to partner with districts and other LEAs and the flexibility to do so, and to partner with nonprofits. There are also some provisions that can provide you with protections if you feel that your state is unduly cutting state and local resources through maintenance of effort protections and maintenance of equity. We're not going to go into that today, but just know that there are other protections. As well, if you don't get Title I at all and you're not necessarily receiving funds on a formula basis, there are those reserve funds at the state level. I know some states have taken into consideration funding schools that aren't otherwise getting Title I funding, so there could be opportunities there. The department is starting to put out resources, and this is one of them. This is their volume 2 resource where they've asked organizations to submit their practices around areas of creating safe learning environments, addressing lost instructional time, and supporting educator and staff stability and well-being. So there's a lot in here, but you should just be aware that this is a resource that they've recently issued and could be of help. And this, just to remind you what the timelines are, the different tranches of funding have different endpoints by which all funds must be obligated, but the largest pot of funding should be available till the end of fiscal year 24, perhaps even a few months beyond that due to some arcane budget rules. But really, it's the end of 2024 that you should be looking at to spend these funds. And that is it for me.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Crystal Madison with Amazon. We do have a couple of questions for you, Christy, if I can ask a few right now. LEAs funds, if that's their first year of opening.
I'm sorry, Crystal, I don't know if it was my end or your end. I didn't quite hear what you were saying. I can open the questions though. I missed the first part of your question. Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Be mine. Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Christy?
Yep.
So Christy, I'll jump in while Crystal gets her connection working. So the first question is, are charter school LEAs able to access funds if they open in 21-22 for the first school year?
So the department did put together specific guidance on allocations to new and significantly expanding charter schools. There are rules that address this just in general for Title I to make sure that charters get funding even if they're new or have a significant change in enrollment. And they do seem to be applying those rules for new schools that are opening this fall. Now, beyond that, I don't know what they will do, but there were specific provisions related to this fall. Now, it also depends on your Title I eligibility, but.
It looks like there's another question. Is there a CFDA number associated with the ESSER fund since they are subject to the UG audits?
I am sure there is, but I don't know what that would be. But all the programs at the department have CFDA numbers. At least all the ones that I've seen. Let's see, I have the questions open, Patty, so I could go. And if we need to keep moving, I'm also happy to do type answers. So just tell me how we're doing on timing, and otherwise I can post answers to these.
Well, at this point, let's turn it over to Morgan. So he and Vince can kind of talk about how this can be applied at the school level from people who are really interested and active in the day-to-day.
All right, thank you. Just as a quick introduction, my name is Morgan Mattrell. I am head of charter schools over at Amazon Business, and we invited Vince Moorhead with Success Academy. Vince, I'll go ahead and let you introduce yourself and give an overview of Success Academy.
All right, thank you, Morgan. So my name is Vincent Moorhead. I lead procurement here at Success Academy. We're a charter school that operates out of New York City. We run and operate roughly 45 schools throughout just New York City, over 20,000 students and roughly a little below 3,000 employees total. And our charter schools operate from K all the way through 12th grade.
Excellent, thanks. And so the reason why we invited Vincent to join us is because here at Amazon Business, we are noticing, especially this year as schools are reopening, that a significant uptick in the amount of spend that's going through our marketplace, going directly to charter schools. For example, the first quarter, there was about a significant double-digit increase. And so we wanted to work with the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools and Christy, and then also bring Vincent in to ensure that as you all are spending, that we give you the tools and the features, and that you have the knowledge aware to make sure that the purchases are compliant and that you're tracking appropriately. So I think let's take a step back. Vincent, the first question I have for you is, how did Success Academy change based on the new way of life between in-person and remote learning and staff at home and or coming back into the office?
Yeah, so it's been a lot of changes, and they're frequent and they're constant change. So with the pandemic, Success made the decision to actually not do the hybrid type model during the pandemic. We closed our schools and we stayed remote. We actually are still remote, and we're planning to open back up August 2nd. So this is before we, receive some of the new good guidance about how, the CDC just recently said something, about how, if you're vaccinated without masks and things like that. But we wanted to not continuously shift the way that our students were being educated. And we were trying to really focus on, if we were remote, making sure we can give them the best experience possible. Especially as a couple of months ago, all of you know, but as schools were going through and having COVID scares in each one of the schools, they were shutting down, opening up. It just caused a lot of disruptions. And that's something that we just decided we didn't want to put our students through that. So now as we look forward and we're thinking, okay, well, what does next year look like? There's been multiple plans, all of which have been predicated based off of, well, what is social distance requirements, or, what is vaccine requirements, and especially hiring new teachers, they need to get tested, and what are the testing requirements? So we've gotten to a place now where we have a plan for our scholars to come back and be in person. We've been having weekly meetings with multiple functional teams to think about what type of technology we'll need to be able to support that, as well as what type of schooling design changes we needed to make sure that our students could be in the classroom and still get a good experience. So one specific example is we use a lot of hand manipulatives, and now scholars will be using computers instead of like paper products. So we actually have to change the way that we teach and that we actually do our lessons to make sure that they can continue to use the computers like they have been for the last year. Right. So it becomes really complicated. And I am super thankful for the school leadership that we have here. LeMay, she leads up the school's leadership. I work very closely with a woman named Marnie. She's been outstanding, right? Just going through and trying to think through schooling related, teacher related, school operations or school systems, how those change. So, we're looking forward to, they'll be in person. We're going to try and really push to have our scholars back in person. I know everyone has been aware of the learning loss that has happened over this last year. We do feel that, students being in person gives them a better opportunity than, being remote whenever possible. And we have plans for if we have to close down schools. We have backup plans for what going to a remote looks like. We've looked at hybrid technology to see, or streaming technology, just in case we need to have some population of our students that don't feel comfortable coming into schools. We're allowing them to be able to elect to be remote for some time. But we've actually surveyed our families, and it's actually a very small population that want to stay home. I think people are actually ready to get back. So very long answer, but the idea is that it started in one place and has gotten to a place where we're closer to people coming back in person. But there's still so many changes in a classroom that required us to now do things differently than we did like 2 years ago.
can you touch a little bit more on that? Two parts, two follow-up questions. One, how many different departments are involved within your organization in terms of reopening schools?
So I can tell you that this has been the most cross-functional school year that I've had. We have meetings where we have advisory, and we have a schooling function that deals with like school leadership, senior leaders, principals, and down the education arm. Academics, of course, that's another arm for us. And then we have school operations, which is another arm underneath our ops team. Technology. I mean, those are people that I'm seeing 3-4 times weekly now on different topics. But as you go through and think about all the different school systems, even our school safety comes into mind, right? When we think about how do we even get scholars into the school with them doing a type of survey to say that they don't feel sick, similar to if you go into like, restaurants and things, how do you get that in place and not have a line up the block because there's like, 200-300 students checking into the school at the same time, right? So it's been very cross-functional with different teams to try and think through everything to, and to do our best to make sure we try to think through everything.
And then the second part of my follow-up question was going to be in regards to what you're talking about, preparing the classroom. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, so specifically what we've looked into is we took a step back. Our students have been remote for a year. So we had to do emergency purchases for devices last year. And we could probably talk more about that later. And now that they're using the devices, we're using things like writing technology that allows us to imagine if you handed out like a math workbook, they can do that now on a computer. And there's a grading software in it as well. So we want them to continue to use things like that while they're in the classroom. So to keep that consistent. So now that you have scholars all in classrooms with over 30 computers, all grades K through 12, you're charging solutions. You have to think about something like that, right? And then if we are going to have, like I mentioned, we have streaming technology. We're going to have some specific classrooms where there may be scholars that are at home with a teacher, and then there may be students in the class as well. So how do you still give them a sense of being in the same class? And something that's very big to success is allowing students to interact and defend and talk to points with each other. It's something that's big in our ideology for like learning. And we wanted to make sure that we could have 20 something people on the Zoom, as well as students in the classroom, and they can still interact and talk to each other. So like we've bought some classrooms where they'll have like a monitor in the classroom so they can see the other Zoom participants. With we've bought a piece of technology that it's like a camera where it follows the teacher. So as they're speaking in the front of the classroom, it can follow the teacher with microphones that are set up in the classroom. So this way that the students can talk into the microphones. And this setup isn't everywhere, but this is we did it for a small percentage to make sure that, the ones that decided that they wanted to still stay remote can still get a similar experience or as close as possible to being in person.
Excellent. So let's use that example of some of the technology purchases that you've made. What actions do you take to ensure that your organization is getting or is taking those purchases and making sure that the funding source, if it's ESSER funds, is getting approved?
Yeah. So that's a good question. So there's two parts to it, right? So all of the prior purchases in the middle of the pandemic, we were making purchases. We didn't know if we were going to get funding or not, right? We were hoping we would, but we had to do whatever was necessary. Our students from K to 3 did not have devices. We were one of the more fortunate schools that actually pushed out devices to different grades for 4 and up. So, we just went out, we tried to find the best device, something that was, cost effective as well as could provide the needs. And we did that. that rolled out quickly. Realized later, we need better devices. For some of them, they were breaking a lot. So then we made some other decision on devices. And what we've done is, from a tagging perspective, we went back and looked through, that's the one good thing about all of the grants. They allow you to go back to when the pandemic started, and really go back and tag and allocate those funds. So for the purchases we've already made, it was fortunate that we just had everything set up where we did competitive bids and everything. We have all of the documentation. So we just needed to apply. The first one that came out was the CARES Act. So we applied, and then some of it was tagged there. We're working on ESSER, on some of the different ESSERs, and we're applying it to that as well. For future initiatives, we are being very particular on making sure that we follow the guidance. Each grant has very specific guidance that, you should make sure you pay attention to before trying to tag something to it. More recently, the last one that came out, and Christy knows this way better than I do, but I believe it was the FCC one, the grant that just came out. It's actually pretty restrictive, right? And it's very specific to if scholars are like remote, right? And a lot of if you read some of the fine print, that one didn't work as well for us, right? For some of the things some of the purchases we made, especially if you've done planning. The FCC one seemed like it was more towards schools that are doing planning right now. Whereas if you've done the planning in the past already, you've already made some of the purchases. So you have to wait until the second round of funding and to see what was left over to be able to accommodate for past purchases. So I just know that because that's top of mind. I literally have a meeting after this about ESSER and FCC, and we have like weekly meetings about the grants internally. But just going back to the point where it's the future ones, we're looking at what are some of the things that affect the learning loss gap, and really going through team by team. And I'm really learning a lot about the organization, I'll be honest, at this point, because some things that I wouldn't have known, people like, oh yeah, no, like psychiatrists or like other things that, longer school days. Oh, we're actually doing this as a school design change. It's like, wow, that actually counts, right? So but you don't know until like you are very speaking cross-functionally to like multiple teams.
So as you're having these conversations and you're learning cross-functionally about what applies, what doesn't, what are some of your best recommendations, and what are you all doing internally to track?
Yeah. So what we did was for the CARES application, we put that one together first, and we created like a running Excel that actually lists out specific initiatives. And instead of just people throwing stuff into a list, we actually have them talking to one of the core team members before it even gets on the list. So we can do some type of vetting. And then when it's on the list, we're actually like vetting and re-vetting these types of projects, right? Like, hey, does this make sense? Does it still match the guidelines? We have on our immediate team, we have someone from finance and also someone from our legal team who is actually reading through the documentation and saying, and rightfully so, questioning and pushing like, hey, I need details of why you want this on the list. And if it doesn't like make the cut, she takes it off. So it's a good process where, I'll come up with an idea and she's like, no. And then she'll come up with an idea and it's like, no. And to the point where like, we know the stuff that's on the list, we can actually defend, right? I think that's the biggest point, right? Like, don't just come and think that any expense, anything that comes to mind, you're just going to get reimbursed for. That is not the case. These have to be very specific costs. You have to be able to defend them.
So talk a little bit more about that. Like, do you track in a spreadsheet, or what does that process look like?
Yeah, so for right now, we track there's the first part is application. So we're tracking all the initiatives in a spreadsheet. And it's a Google spreadsheet that we share with each other, and we go in and we're adjusting the numbers, making sure that they're as close to accurate as possible. For anything that's a past purchase, we'll have the exact numbers. going forward, it's an estimate. The hard thing as well is to understand that this is multiple years. So doing your best to try and estimate as best as possible. Then if ESSER is going to operate the same way as CARES, once your application was approved, the money's allocated, then you have to go in and draw the funds. And that's when you need to actually show expenses, right? And that process is managed by another person on the team that manages grants for us here. And the reason I'm specifying the difference between the two is because at the first stage, it's just ideas and the best estimates you have possible. But when you actually start drawing the funds, that's when you have exact numbers, you have all the defense, all of the documentation needs to be buttoned up. And another thing to remember as schools in general, but specifically charter schools, make sure that when you're drawing the funds, you may hit caps on some of your different charters, and it may be lower than the estimate. So you just need to kind of think through that. And then as you're using CARES and ESSER or any of these multiple grants, that you're not double counting anything, right? Like we're being very strenuous to make sure that nothing is double counted between grants.
So I think what's interesting to call out is the fact that an organization as your size of 47 schools and 21,000 scholars over across the sites is starting with a simple Google spreadsheet when it comes to ingesting those ideas. And that's something that's scalable to a single site school as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I know there's a lot of software that does like grant management and things, but I think low tech actually worked well here for us because, it really made us focus in on what is the initiative and less about the process of collecting it.
And what do you do with the tracking of those expenses along with that plan? Is that in a spreadsheet, or do you what's the word I'm looking for? Archive the data for audit purposes? Yeah.
So the Excel is just a list, and then for the actual tagging of funds and drawing, the grant director, that's when it becomes a lot more complicated. He has folders with documentation based off the purchase, how much has been drawn. He has multiple files that show exactly what he's drawn from like specific grants. But this is like his full-time job. So that's literally what he's doing. And the document, I do know that there's a lot of documentation that is kept. So for example, I did an RFP for some of the devices that we purchased. All of my RFP documents are going into, his folder as backup documentation.
Excellent. So let's shift gears a little bit here. I'm curious, what examples is success making to enhance purchasing?
Yeah, so, and we spoke about this before, but I'll kind of just repeat really quickly. One of the first things I did when I got here was actually implemented a new purchasing system. And the purchasing system, I wanted it to be very user-friendly. I decided to go with Coupa. And it has a lot of different functionalities. I talked about some of the other ones, but specific to now, one of the things that we did was our billing strand, for example, has to do with like, our entity, our cost centers, and it has all of these, basic things that you would see for accounting. But then there's two at the end that are optional, which are if there's a funding source and if there's an activity code. So what we've been able to do with a lot of these purchases is now provide guidance where people need to tag an activity code or funding source. Well, mainly activity code, but if it's like a COVID related expense, now when we run a report, our grants director can go run a report on that activity code and then sparse through a smaller set of purchases to see if those actually are redeemable or not. So for example, we were thinking about purchasing PPE centrally at first, especially when there was big shortages. Now that it's widely available, we're going to let our schools just purchase as if it's a regular disposable item. And if they tag it, now we can just go back and try to get reimbursed for the PPE that we purchase. Okay. But with the actual system, we've rolled out list of supplies. We do a lot of sourcing items and then provide direction on where to go to get those. So for example, we sourced PPE and we said, here goes the list. These are the approved PPE items. Go buy them, at your heart's content, right? But what we try to do is make it where people don't buy random things as much as possible. Like, for example, with the masks, we want to make sure that they're wearing masks, right? And, stuff like bandanas and different things like that. We don't want them wearing those, that type of material. So we have like, hey, here go the masks you should wear. That makes sense.
Yes. And so when those get put into the system, what's that tagging process look like?
Yeah, so it's user friendly where you add an item to the cart. When you add it into the cart, it's very simple where it will say the item, you just click down to the billing string and it just say this is COVID related expense. And then you submit it for approval. There's many systems that have, functionality like this. I know, Coupa is just one of them. Morgan, we use Amazon for a lot of stuff. And I know Amazon has functionality where they can do stuff like this as well. This is something that in some of the newer systems is a lot easier and is easier for reporting. But it helps with compliance, right? So another thing we could also do is when we preload items on catalogs, we can default the billing string and have it already tagged as well.
In the systems that Vincent's discussing about within your Amazon business account, you have the ability to establish what we call our budget management tool. So it is, or commonly known as a blanket PO, but it allows you to set a budget in terms of how much you want to spend on a certain grant through Amazon Business. And then as you, the requisitioner, whoever your shoppers are within your organization, within your school, can then, if they're making a COVID related purchase, can tag that during checkout. So that way, when you go to reconcile or download purchasing data from Amazon Business, for example, through Business Analytics, you will be able to have a CSV file as well as download PDF copies of your invoices or your order summaries. That way you can provide that back to your, for reimbursement of those expenses. And then I just think the other thing is, and Vincent, you and Success and I worked on this together, as we saw the increase in ESSER funds this year, we are proactively increasing our pay by invoice lines that we provide to charter schools, and our finance team reworked some of our business rules where any charter school is eligible at the beginning up to a $50,000 line. And then we work from there based on planned budgets or your audited financials. So if you are a charter school that is currently using Amazon Business and concerned about your invoice line, we will be putting in a chat an email address so you can reach out to connect with your customer advisor, and we can proactively work with you on that part.
Yeah, I can tell you that was a huge help. Not to get into too many details, but we were making some large purchases, some emergency purchases that Amazon was able to help out with. So what we were able to do is really just let them know about some of the grants, and we were able to very quickly, adjust our credit line.
It's about within a week, we were able to double, I think, the line there.
Yeah.
So one of the things another kind of question I have is, what recommendations do you have regarding cash management for long-term expenses?
Wow, that's a good one. So COVID made you kind of rethink everything, right? So as you know, we had different things that we were purchasing on lease versus actually purchasing in cash, and trying to figure out when we made those decisions, it was pre grants, right? So it was just a matter of like, how can we do this the best way and we don't know what the future looks like, right? So as you move forward with now the grants, it has to be based off of the actual expenses. So just kind of keeping in mind that, if you're doing any type of leasing and if it's for a purchase that is going to actually be used within like if your lease doesn't match the actual usage of your devices, you could potentially like miss out, right? So like if don't do 4-year leases for machines that you only use for 3 years, right? Like that's like one example, right? I'm not saying that's what we did, but as you're going back and trying to get the funds back, it's based off of when the expenses actually come out. So, you know, to answer your question directly now, so we did some type of leasing for different things, certain initiatives with suppliers to look at payment terms. And now with the upcoming grants, we are also just thinking about like when they may potentially open up and allow reimbursements. But, you know, I would just say you have to operate personally. One of the things that I've been talking about with my finance team, it just might not be the best for everyone, but you have to operate as if you don't know you're going to get the funds, right? So you have to operate your business, right? Don't operate it like you won't meet payroll if you don't get this fund reimbursed, right? Like that's not the way to operate. Especially because you need to, you know, you never know, like I mentioned earlier, when you go back for reimbursement, will you max out on one of your charters and not get the full amount that you were anticipating and something like, you know. So from a cash management perspective, we're trying to do like what's best for the business. But one of the things that we're also looking at is, you know, if we were to buy out leases, right? Like if we plan to do this for 3 years anyway, if we could buy out the lease and then kind of like, and potentially not pay interest because of it, is there some type of benefit, right? We don't know. We're still trying to work through stuff like that, but these are things that we just consider and think through.
So, also, how's success planning post ESSER? I mean, you know, it is kind of a little bit of, not saying the wild, wild west in terms of what's available for schools this year, but it, you know, from other customers that I've spoken with, they've already projected a budget surplus this year, and then the additions of the questions, or I'm sorry, the funding as well. So what steps are you taking now to make sure the investments that you're using with these funds, planning for afterward?
Yeah. So one of the things that we realized coming out of the pandemic, we had a decision point. We could have made it where some of the things we did were temporary, or if some of the stuff became long-term and we decided to keep. And we chose the latter for, you know, as much as possible, right? So like, you know, we're looking at ways where we can push becoming more digital and using less paper. And we're looking at ways to, you know, use the technology, like I mentioned, in the classrooms, right? So when we're planning with, you know, with ESSER, it's more of a like, hey, this is the new way that we're going to, like, this is what we needed to do to respond to the pandemic. We're going to try and go back and get reimbursed, but it's, you know, after ESSER, we're still going to have to operate, if that makes sense. So I will say that we're not making decisions because there's funding available, if that makes sense. We're making the decisions and we're seeing what can be tagged and what can be reimbursed.
I think that's a good point to call out, is not making a purchasing decision just because there's funds available, but what's going to be the long-term success for your scholars, and then of course your families and faculty and staff as well.
Right. Like when you look at, you know, the devices, I think everybody hears about it so much, but like if you really took a step back and thought about like how you learned in school and like how much hands-on things you've used in schools, like counting manipulatives and things. And now to say that we have a new generation of students that use devices from such a young age, and it's just the way that they operate, right? So to not have, you know, kids that are in third or, you know, let's say third grade using devices, it's almost like they're behind, if that makes sense, right? They should be able to do basic stuff on devices because this is the new way of life, like for people, especially post-pandemic, right? So we're doing them a disservice by not providing them the tools and helping them be able to do that. And that's why it just needs to be something we do long term.
So are you all planning to use some of the, or maybe if you can speak a little bit of how you're using ESSER funds to help address the loss of learning?
Yeah, so there's a lot of there's a laundry list of items that we're thinking through, but I'll touch the big ones that everyone knows about. It's definitely PPE. That's one of the big ones. There's definitely technology. We're looking at other things that have affected the learning, the gap. It could be we went through multiple school design changes, and some of them were going to affect the length of our day. So there were ideas on there about that. We typically in the past would have had Wednesdays that were half days. We basically allowed teachers to do trainings and things on Wednesdays. We going forward is considering if that's gonna change or not, which would make our days longer or our weeks longer. We have teacher certifications that are additional certifications that are happening. We may or may not tag that stuff. So, and I'm speaking to you like in real time, so I don't know if we're actually going to do some of it or not yet, but those are a lot of the things that are on the list. Then of course we have like Wi-Fi for students and some of the students that are in public housing and underprivileged students. They may need some support. Then signage, it's the laundry list of stuff that everyone just thinks about and kind of knows is really on that list. But then there's changes to curriculum, academic changes to curriculum. Like I mentioned, we're going digital. So that's speaking where we may have to use different software platforms that may have been something that we had paper before. One of the things I even looked at was it was a software platform that actually helped with students' enunciation in speech, right? I'm telling you the types of stuff that I learned now. I'm not an educator, but this is like been amazing to see some of it. But there's just so many things when you think through a full curriculum for students, like so many things that you actually have to touch on to make sure that it's the same or as good of an experience.
And then in the last 4 to 5 minutes that we have here, just wanted to provide an opportunity for you to give the attendees some closing thoughts on just what you like, the top 3 maybe things to think about as they move forward purchasing with these funds.
Yeah, so I would say, make sure that you work cross-functional and really just, take this as an opportunity to hear what some of the different things are going on in some of your different teams. We were so surprised to hear some of the things that the teams were actually working on and we had no clue about, right? So just really questioning them, hey, making sure that it's not like, don't come up with a new idea because they're funds, right? But just, hey, what are some of the different things you've had to do because of the learning loss? I can tell you that we had a meeting with someone last week, and it was a very big reimbursement possibility, and we just had no clue about it. And we've been meeting about this weekly, right? So just make sure that you work cross-functional. Also, just as you're making the decisions, it's very easy to think about just the next 1 or 2 years. But if you are really trying to plan out for, the full length of these funds, it can become a little complicated. So really trying to do your best to think through stuff. Like, for example, technology, if you have a technology refresh program, you should be thinking about the next time you have to buy devices, right? Like it's more than likely that a device in a kid's hand for 3 years is not going to make it, right? So you might as well just you also should be planning for the next time.
I mean, some of us are lucky if we can keep an iPhone for 2 years, right?
Right, exactly, right. And then lastly, I'll just, kind of reiterate, just it's, do not try to take this as an opportunity to like misuse funds. I think as charter schools, we should absolutely not put ourselves in a position to be on the front of a newspaper, like, because of misusing funds, right? Like, if you think hard enough in your organization, you'll find that there's a lot of stuff that you're already paying for that might meet the list. And it's do the upfront work to find the additional costs and like understand the business instead of creating something and trying to tag something that you shouldn't really be getting reimbursed for and then having to pay for it later. I would anticipate that the auditing afterwards is going to be very strict, very stringent. Similar to, it's funny, I don't know if you're on social media, you can hear about everybody joking about people getting locked up because of PPE loans. Like, I feel like that's going to be the next thing, right? Like where all of these people, all these schools are going to misallocate and just take money that they know they shouldn't have been taking. And I do think there's going to be a heavy audit afterwards.
All right. Thank you, Vincent. So just to close on that, anything for you all attending, Amazon Business is equipped to help you with that. If you can't afford, or at this time, an ERP system or a e-procurement system such as Coupa, we have those functionality, and I'll drop that email and address in the chat if you want to get connected with somebody on our team to make sure that your account is configured to track those spend. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Patricia.
Awesome. Thank you so much to everyone who has participated in the event. We really want to say that this has been one of the most requested webinars that to date, and one of our best attended. So we appreciate all of the work. We appreciate the wisdom of Christy, of Morgan, and of Vincent. And really thank you all for joining us today. We encourage you to stay in touch. We'll share the recording and all of the resources in a follow-up email to all the attendees. And we also have other recordings and resources available on our website at www.publiccharters.org/webinars. So thank you all so much for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we will talk to you all soon.